There's a moment, and I think most people who have worked in deep space administration have had it at least once, where you look up from whatever you're doing and realize the room has changed temperature without anyone touching a dial. Not literally, well, sometimes literally depending on which species just walked in. But I mean it in the emotional sense. That particular drop in atmospheric pressure that happens when someone powerful enters a space and decides, before they've even taken their second step, that everyone in it is beneath them. I'd felt it maybe a dozen times in my 4 years, stationed at Meridian Hub 7. I'd never felt it the way I felt it that morning. Let me back up. Meridian Hub 7 isn't the kind of place that makes it onto recruitment posters. It's not glamorous. It's not dangerous enough to be exciting and not comfortable enough to be pleasant. It sits in a mid-transit zone between 3 contested star systems, which means it processes about 60,000 beings per standard day and smells, in the lower corridors, like recycled atmosphere and something that might be industrial solvent or might be a Vorthari's lunch. We've never been able to settle the question. I was stationed there as a liaison coordinator, which sounds important and is mostly not. You manage paperwork. You translate documents. You smooth over the small frictions that happen when 15 different species try to use the same corridor with regulations, and none of them have the same idea of what constitutes a hallway. My office, if you could call it that, was a glass-walled room off the main atrium on level 4, which meant I had a full, unobstructed view of the central floor at all times. And the central floor of Meridian Hub 7, on a busy morning, is something to see. The atrium itself is maybe 80 meters across. The ceiling is domed, a Confederation architectural standard, apparently chosen to make beings of all different heights feel equally small, which I always thought was either very democratic or deeply sinister depending on your mood. The floor is a pale mineral composite they call saltstone. It's expensive. It's beautiful. It reflects light in a way that makes the space feel almost holy in the mornings, when the external panels are dialed up to simulate dawn. And every single morning, without fail, there was a man mopping it. His name was Admiral. That's all I knew about him for almost 2 years. Admiral, the guy who mopped the saltstone floor. He was probably in his early 60s, though honestly with some people it's hard to tell. He had that particular quality of face that looks like it decided on an age decades ago and simply committed to it. Deep-set eyes. A jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. Skin the color of old mahogany, weathered in the way that only comes from actually being somewhere hard for a long time. He didn't talk much. He said good morning when you passed him. He held doors. He moved with this quiet efficiency that was almost meditative, the way really experienced people move through repetitive tasks, not rushed, not resentful, just present. Like the floor deserved his full attention and he was going to give it. I'd nodded at him 100 times, smiled, done that thing where you make eye contact just long enough to acknowledge someone's humanity without making it weird. I'd never once asked him his last name. That was my failure, not his. The day in question was a 7th cycle Tuesday by Hub Standard Time, which maps to nothing useful in Earth terms but felt like the middle of a long week, which I suppose is its own kind of universal. I got in early. I had a stack of transit variance applications to process before the morning rush, and the coffee situation in the Hub's human-accessible food court was, as always, a matter requiring personal intervention. I'd learned to bring my own. I was at my desk by 6:30. The atrium below was quiet. Maintenance crews were finishing their night rotations. The cleaning drones had already done their first pass on the upper levels, and Admiral, I could see him from my window, was doing his manual sweep of the saltstone floor with that long-handled tool of his. Part mop, part buffer. He'd modified it somewhere along the way, added something to the head that left the floor with this particular kind of sheen that the automated systems never quite achieved. He moved in slow, overlapping arcs, left to right. Back to the wall, methodical. The floor looked like still water in the morning light. I remember thinking that specifically. I was sitting there with my coffee going cold and my transit forms untouched, and I was watching him and thinking, that floor looks like still water. That was 6:41. At 7:18, the doors to the main receiving corridor opened. And everything changed. Admiral Thesavac Ravin of the Kelthari Dominion, walked into Meridian Hub 7 like he'd already decided to be disappointed by it. I'd seen Kelthari before. They were a common enough presence in the outer transit zones, tall, bilaterally symmetrical like humans, but built on a different set of principles, like someone had taken the concept of a person and refined it according to aesthetics rather than practicality. The Kelthari were 7 feet tall on average and moved with this unsettling liquid grace that their military trained extra hard to make intimidating. They had skin that shifted between deep violet and near black depending on their emotional state, and eyes that were solid silver, no pupil, no iris, just this flat reflective surface that picked up every light in the room and gave nothing back. Ravin was in full Dominion Admiral regalia, which, for context, means about 15 different layers of significance that most non-Kelthari couldn't read, but that were apparently the equivalent of walking in with a sign that said every decision made in this building in the last decade was made wrong and I am here to tell you why. He had 4 attendants, military aides, all Kelthari, all in lesser regalia that was still more impressive than anything the hub's security personnel were wearing. He had a personal herald, an actual herald, a small drone that hovered at his left shoulder and projected a continuous low-frequency tone that was, according to Kelthari protocol, the acoustic equivalent of a rank announcement. In practice, it sounded like a very expensive refrigerator. There were 6 hub security officers at the main receiving desk. I watched 3 of them stand up straighter when Ravin walked in. One of them reached for a comm unit. The other 2 just stared. The Admiral didn't look at any of them. He looked at the floor. Specifically, and I watched this happen in real time from my glass-walled office, he looked at Errol. Errol was maybe 20 meters from the main entrance when Ravin came through. He was mid-arc with his buffer, head down, working a section near the center of the atrium. He hadn't looked up. He probably hadn't heard the doors over whatever he was running through his head. Errol always had this slightly interior quality about him, like part of his attention was always somewhere else, not spacey, not absent, just occupied. Ravin stopped. Not a polite pause, not the kind of stop that means let me get my bearings. The kind of stop that means I have identified something offensive and I am deciding what to do about it. His attendants stopped behind him in perfect unison. The herald drone adjusted its position. And Ravin said something to the nearest aide, not loud enough for me to hear from up on 4, but loud enough that I could see the aide's expression, which was that particular combination of eager and uncomfortable that junior officers get when they're being asked to relay something they already know is going to go badly. The aide stepped forward. His voice, amplified by a personal comm unit, carried clearly to the upper levels. The Admiral queries, "Why is a biological servant cleaning a Confederation facility? Where are the sanitation units?" Errol stopped moving. He straightened up slowly, not startled, not rattled, just the careful straightening of someone who has been interrupted mid-task and is taking a moment to register the interruption properly. He turned around. He looked at the aide, then, without moving his gaze, sort of took in the Admiral behind the aide. "Morning," Errol said. "Sanitation units already ran. I'm doing the detail pass." The aide translated, or relayed, whatever you call it when a Kelthari military officer repeats something to a superior in a language the superior understands but has decided not to use. Ravin's skin shifted from the deep violet baseline toward something darker, which in Kelthari terms means something like contempt mixed with mild amusement, the kind of amusement that isn't warm. He spoke again, the aide translated. The Admiral notes that biological maintenance personnel are inefficient, imprecise, and an unnecessary use of corridor space. He suggests the facility upgrade its systems. I set down my coffee. Errol looked at the aide for a moment, then he looked at the floor around him, then he looked back. "The automated units do a fine job," he said in that unhurried voice of his. "I just finish what they miss." This was apparently the wrong answer, or rather it was an answer which was itself the wrong thing. In Kelthari protocol, and I knew this, had sat through enough cultural briefings to know this, a biological service worker responding to a senior admiral's commentary with anything other than acknowledgement and deference was a breach of something. Not law, exactly. Closer to physics, the way the Kelthari thought about rank. Ravin stepped forward, actually moved toward Errol, which caused one of the hub security officers downstairs. I could see him from my window. I could see the exact moment he decided not to intervene, to take a half step and then stop. The Admiral was now maybe 3 meters from Errol. His full height, that liquid graceful posture, that flat silver gaze aimed directly down at a 60-something-year-old man in a gray maintenance uniform holding a long-handled buffer. He spoke, not to the aide this time, directly, in Kelthari, which carries a particular resonance at that volume that isn't quite sonic and isn't quite not. The aide translated anyway, out of what I suspected was pure professional reflex. The Admiral says he has stood in 17 throne rooms and never once seen a human being fulfilling a role that would not be better served by a machine. He finds it instructive that this is how your kind chooses to exist. Small work, narrow corridors, wet floors. The last 2 words, wet floors, landed with a particular quality. That kind of dismissal that's almost too precise, like whoever said it took aim. The security officer downstairs picked up his comm. I was already standing. Errol looked at the Admiral for a long moment. He didn't step back. He didn't look down. He didn't do any of the things that a person does when they're trying to make themselves smaller in front of something large. He just looked with those deep-set eyes, that carved jaw. And then he said, in a voice that I could hear clearly from level 4 even without amplification, in the same unhurried tone he'd used to tell you it was raining. I've met 3 Kelthari admirals in my time. You're the 4th. None of them ever seemed to have a problem with wet floors until they walked across one that'd been done right. Silence. Not quiet, the hub was never quiet. There was always the ambient hum of the environmental systems, and the distant echo of corridor traffic, and the low tone of Ravin's Herald drone. But the kind of silence that happens inside sound when something shifts. Ravin's skin went very dark. The aide looked like he would strongly prefer to be somewhere in a different star system. I want to tell you that I'd noticed something off about Errol before this moment, that I'd seen hints, that I'd been paying attention in some way that made me perceptive or clever. But I hadn't. I was watching the same scene everyone else was watching, a maintenance worker talking back to a very important alien admiral. And I was having the same thought everyone else was having, which was some combination of oh no and oh wow, actually. What nobody was thinking yet, what nobody had any reason to think yet, was who is this man? That came later. That came in pieces. And by the time the last piece arrived, I will tell you honestly, I sat down on the floor of my office and stayed there for a while. The immediate aftermath of Errol's response was a kind of crystallized standoff. Ravin hadn't moved. Errol hadn't moved. The aide was doing something complicated with his posture that suggested he was trying to be present and absent simultaneously. Then Director Male Sundqvist came through the side corridor at almost a run. Sundqvist ran Meridian Hub 7's administration division. She was a compact Scandinavian woman in her 50s with the kind of energy that filled rooms sideways, and she had clearly been informed of the Admiral's arrival with exactly enough time to be just slightly behind it. She came through that corridor with 2 aides of her own, and a look on her face that said she was doing 7 different calculations at once and still managing to smile. "Admiral Ravin," she said, warm and precise in Kelthari, "welcome to Meridian Hub 7. I'm Director Sundqvist. We've been expecting you. I apologize for not meeting you at the bay. We had a transit timing adjustment." Ravin turned from Errol the way you turn from something you finished with. Not dismissively, exactly, more like he'd filed it, made a note, moving on. He spoke to Sundqvist in that same Kelthari register that assumed translation was beneath him. His aide relayed. "The Admiral requests that the Director ensure her facility's maintenance protocols are reviewed. He is unaccustomed to biological interruptions in official transit spaces." Sundqvist nodded in a way that agreed with the Admiral without agreeing with the Admiral, which was a skill she'd clearly spent years perfecting. "Of course, we'll look into that." She gestured toward the upper corridors. "If you'll follow me to the conference suite." The Admiral followed her. His attendants fell in behind him. The Herald drone adjusted its altitude. And they were gone into the upper levels. The atrium exhaled. Errol watched them go, then he looked at his buffer, then he went back to work. I watched him pick up exactly where he'd left off, the same arc, the same overlap, the same attention, and I thought, that is either the most well-adjusted person on this station or the most complicated one. As it turned out, it was both. I went down to the atrium about 20 minutes later, after the morning rush had filled in and the moment had been swallowed by noise and movement, and the general ongoing business of a mid-transit hub running at 60% capacity. I told myself I was going to the food court. I wasn't going to the food court. Errol was near the eastern wall by then, doing something to the solstone near one of the support columns where the automated units always seemed to skip a section. He had his head down, that concentrated posture. I walked over. That was something, I said, which was not my most eloquent opening. Errol glanced up. Him. The Admiral earlier. He considered this for a moment. He have a nice walk up to the conference suite. He seemed fine. Sundqvist does good work. I paused. You okay? He looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that felt slightly evaluating, though not unkindly. I'm fine. Why? A Kelthari Admiral just publicly. I searched for the right word and settled on the least inflammatory one, dismissed you. Errol went back to the column section. Fourth one, he said. You mentioned that. First one was at the Arcturus Convention, 47 by Old Earth reckoning. Second was on Vesson Station. Third was in the Confederacy halls on Praxis. He buffed the solstone methodically. They all think it's an insult, the floor work. They see a uniform and they see a category. And what do you see? He didn't answer for a moment. Then, a floor that needs doing right. I laughed, and it surprised me, the genuine kind of laugh that comes out before you've decided to have it. He almost smiled, not quite, but the jaw unclenched a little. I told him my name. He told me his last name. Mwangi. Errol Mwangi. I wrote it down in my head the way you write things down when you don't know why they're important yet. The report came 3 days later. In the normal course of events, it would never have come to me at all. Liaison coordinators don't receive security flags on maintenance personnel. That's not our division, not our clearance, not our business. But Rovin's visit had generated a formal diplomatic incident report. The Admiral had apparently filed some kind of advisory note about biological protocol violations during official transit, which was the Kelthari bureaucratic equivalent of a strongly worded letter, and which required, under Article 7 of the Hub's Confederation Charter, review by a coordinating officer with diplomatic classification. Which was me, because I was the only one in that category currently on shift. The report landed in my queue at 1440, flagged routine, scheduled for processing at end of shift. I opened it at 1441. It was 3 sections. The incident summary, a dry, formal accounting of the atrium exchange, which managed to make a human janitor responding to a Kelthari Admiral sound like a minor software glitch. The Admiral's advisory note, formal language, requesting review of Meridian Hub 7's personnel deployment in official transit zones, and an attached supplemental. The supplemental was from Hub Security. Standard procedure following a diplomatic incident. Whoever was involved in the exchange gets a routine background pull, making sure nobody's flagged, nobody's compromised, nothing that could escalate the incident into something requiring Confederation attention. The background pull on Errol Mwangi. I almost didn't read it. It was support documentation. It was the kind of thing you're supposed to skim, note, and file. I almost didn't. The first line stopped me. Subject Mwangi Errol Dakarai, Dob. And then a date that I had to do the math on twice, and then a third time with a stylus so I was sure I wasn't misreading my own notation. He was 81. 81 standard Earth years, which even accounting for extended lifespan medical access in deep space postings, which would explain some of it, stations had good medicine, was not a face you'd put at 62 on a good day. Wasn't possible without something more than medicine. I kept reading. Previous postings, declassified. Outpost Kellen 9, Survey Station Oros, Confederation Defense Platform Omega-6, Arcturus Convention Security Detail, Vesson Station Joint Command, Praxis Confederacy Halls, Protocol Division. I stopped. Went back. Read each one again. The Arcturus Convention Security Detail, Wesen Station Joint Command, Praxis Confederacy Halls. These were not maintenance postings. These were, I pulled up the reference files with one hand while reading the security report with the other. These were among the most significant diplomatic and military coordinates in Confederation history over the last 4 decades. Arcturus was where the third alignment was signed. Wesen was where the collective armistice had been brokered. Praxis was the seat of the Confederation legislative body. I'm not in defense. I was never cleared for defense, but even I knew those names. I kept reading and my coffee went cold again, and I didn't notice. Previous designations, declassified, partial. The list that followed was 11 lines long. I will tell you the ones I recognized. Confederation Special Operations, grade indeterminate. Classification, Sovereign Tier. Sovereign Tier wasn't a term I knew from my briefings. I pulled it up. The database returned exactly 4 results, all of which were themselves classified at levels I wasn't cleared for, with a summary notation that said, Sovereign Tier designations are reserved for individuals with cross-system operational history at the level of sustained geopolitical consequence. I sat back in my chair. Sustained geopolitical consequence. I pulled up Errol Mwangi's full service history, what was available, which wasn't much, because every third entry was a black bar that said either classified or redacted, or, in one case, a symbol I'd never seen before that the system identified as a Confederation seal of operational silence, which is apparently a real thing that gets applied to events so significant that even the notation of their significance is considered sensitive. But the dates were there, the postings were there even when the contents weren't. And the thing that kept making my eyes go back to the top of the document was a subheading halfway down, under a section labeled Heritage and Lineage, VRIFIED. I read it once. Then I set the report face down on my desk, stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the atrium where Errol Mwangi was, at this moment, buffing the floor near the eastern support column. Then I went back to the desk. Read it again. 9 dynasties. Not families, dynasties. Verified, historically documented, cross-referenced against Confederation historical archives and independent Earth records. 9 distinct royal and sovereign lineages across 9 different human civilizations going back. The oldest verification was dated 847 CE by old Earth reckoning. 9. The report listed them. I'm going to be careful here because some of these records are still subjects of academic and political sensitivity, and I'm not a historian. But I'll tell you what it said, as plainly as I read it. The Mwangi lineage, verified through maternal descent on 4 separate lines, traced directly to the royal house of a major East African kingdom that by the 12th century CE had controlled trade routes across a significant portion of the continent. Not a minor chieftaincy. An empire. The kind of governing structure that European historians spent 2 centuries trying to minimize and African scholars spent the same 2 centuries reconstructing from the evidence those historians tried to bury. That was the first. The second was a Nubian royal line, pre-Christian, going back to a civilization that had at one point governed Egypt. The verification notation in the security report said, cross-referenced against British Museum records, Egyptian National Archives, and Confederation Historical Registry. Confidence, 97.3%. The third was a minor royal house in the Swahili Coast Trading Network, 14th century, connected through one of the great navigator families. Then it got complicated. 4 and 5 were what the report called colonial-era absorbed dynasties, which is a bureaucratic way of describing royal families whose kingdoms were dismantled by European colonial powers, and whose members either went underground, intermarried into other structures, or dispersed into diaspora communities. The documentation for these was patchwork in some places and solid in others, but the Confederation archivists had apparently done significant forensic genealogical work, and both came back verified. 6 was a surprise. A Western African royal connection through a secondary line, going back to one of the great Saharan trading empires. 7 was a connection, through what the report described as a documented but historically obscured line, to Moorish aristocracy, which itself traced to North African royal descent from the medieval period. 8 was a cross-hemispheric link that had apparently taken the Confederation Genealogical Division 3 years and access to records from 6 different nations to establish, connecting Errol's paternal line to indigenous South American nobility per contact. 9, the ninth one. The ninth one was the one that made me sit on the floor. It was documented separately from the others, with its own subnotation. Lineage 9, contested and verified. The notation said it had been contested initially because the primary documents were held in a private collection, and access had required a formal Confederation archival request, which had taken 11 years to resolve. 11 years of a legal and archival process, all to establish a connection that the report described in the following terms. Subject's lineage through the Mwangiatasa branch includes documented descent from a pre-colonial East African royal house whose ruling dynasty had, at its height, governed a territory larger than contemporary France. The dynasty's collapse was externally precipitated, specifically attributed to the actions of a European colonial power whose designation is noted in Annex C, restricted. The lineage was believed extinct for over 2 centuries. Verification of the subject's connection to this line was made possible through DNA comparison with a known collateral descendant, currently holding the status of recognized cultural monarch in an associated territory. A dynasty thought to be extinct for 2 centuries. And Errol Mwangi, Errol, who mopped the saltstone floor of Meridian Hub 7 every morning at 6:30, was its heir. Not a symbolic heir, not a distant connection. The direct line. I'm going to take a minute here and be honest about something. I'm a liaison coordinator at a mid-transit hub. I process paperwork. I translate documents. I'm not the protagonist of anything, typically. I have had 4 years of a job that is important in the way that all infrastructure is important, and invisible in the way that all infrastructure is invisible. When I read that report, I felt something that I don't entirely have the right vocabulary for. It wasn't quite awe. It wasn't quite guilt. It was something in the vicinity of both, with a layer underneath that was something like the floor looks like still water. That same feeling I'd had at 6:41 that morning, that sense of something being right there, composed and complete, and me having looked straight at it for 2 years without seeing it. Errol Mwangi had come to work at 600 every morning and swept the atrium of a space station in a gray uniform with a modified buffer. And inside that gray uniform was 81 years of a life that included Confederation sovereignteer operations, diplomatic postings at the hinge points of galactic history, the classified contents of something significant enough to warrant an operational silence seal, and 9 royal lineages, one of which had been thought extinct. And this morning, a Kelthari admiral had told him he was small work in a narrow corridor. I filed the incident report, which was my job, and I did it. And then I walked out of my office and down to level 1 and stood at the edge of the atrium for a while. Errol was gone. Shift was over. The saltstone floor glowed under the overhead panels, that still water quality, every arc overlapping perfectly. A group of Confederation officials moved through the atrium toward the upper transit concourse. 4 of them, human, in formal gray and blue attire. The kind of people who moved through spaces like this one as though they owned the approach to every door they'd ever walked through. They crossed the floor without looking down. They didn't notice the way it shone. I don't know why that made me feel something as strongly as it did, but it did. I looked up Errol's shift schedule. I want to say I had good professional reasons for this. I can construct some. They're not entirely wrong. The incident report technically required a coordinating officer to confirm that no further diplomatic exposure existed, which could have been interpreted as requiring a brief follow-up with the involved party. But if I'm being honest, I just wanted to talk to him. He was on at 600 the next morning, same as always. I got in at 5:45. The atrium at 5:45 is as close to quiet as it gets. The overnight skeleton crew is winding down. The environmental systems are doing their pre-dawn cycle adjustment, which creates this particular quality of air, slightly cooler, slightly less recycled feeling, almost like the building is breathing. The external panels are at 30%, still simulating something like late night. Errol came in through the maintenance corridor at 5:59, and I was pretty sure he already knew I was there, because he didn't stop or adjust his trajectory when he saw me. He just walked to where he kept his equipment, got it set up, and then looked over at me from across the atrium. "Early," he said. "I had reading to catch up on," I said. He tilted his head a little. There was something in his expression, not wariness exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a situation he'd been in before. "The report came through," I said. He started his first arc, did it. Standard background pull, after a diplomatic incident. I walked closer. "Errol, the declassified section alone." "Is declassified," he said mildly. "Which means they decided it wasn't worth keeping anymore." 9 dynasties. He buffed, the Soulstone began to take on that quality. 9 verified royal lineages, I said, including one they thought was gone, including whatever's under the operational silence seal that I'm not cleared for and I'm not going to pretend I'm not curious about. He was quiet for a moment, just the sound of the buffer, the environmental cycle. "There are people who spend a lot of energy on legacy," he said finally. "What came before them, what they're heir to, whether the world is treating them the right way given what they're heir to." "That seems reasonable," I said. "It is," he said. "I don't criticize it. But I decided a long time ago that the shape of a life isn't determined by what you're descended from. It's determined by what you actually do." He paused. "I've stood in throne rooms, and I've swept floors, and I will tell you without any hesitation that the floors taught me more." "What did they teach you?" He considered this with the same attention he gave the Soulstone, not performing consideration, actually doing it. "That the things nobody looks at are still there," he said. "That the work that happens when everyone else is asleep or looking somewhere else is still real work. That a floor done right," he completed an arc, "is done right whether anyone notices or not." I stood there in the near dark of the pre-dawn atrium and didn't say anything. "The Admiral," I said eventually. "The Admiral's." "He didn't know." "No," Errol said. "He didn't." He moved to the next section. "That's the part that bothers people usually. They want me to be bothered by it, the insult, the dismissal. And I understand why. Given what the files say, given what the lineage says, there's supposed to be some kind of collision there between what he said and who I actually am, some irony." "There is a collision," I said. "Sure, but the collision isn't between my lineage and his contempt." He looked up at me, those deep-set eyes level and unhurried. "The collision is between his idea of what matters and the reality of what actually does. He was contemptuous of the work, of someone doing necessary work carefully. That collision exists whether I'm a janitor from nowhere or the heir to 9 royal dynasties. The point is the same. The floor needs doing." I opened my mouth. "Closed it." "Okay," I said. "But you have to admit that the floor being done by someone with 9 verified royal lineages is." "Is the universe having a sense of humor?" he said. "Yes, I've noticed." And he almost smiled, and then he went back to work. I don't know what I expected to do with all of this. Write a report, I suppose, file it, move on, process the next stack of transit variance applications. But the thing about a report is it goes somewhere, even when you file it quietly, even when you use the most minimal language and note only what's necessary. Director Sundqvist called me into her office 3 days later. She had the report on her desk. She'd read it, not just skimmed it. I could tell by the way she looked at me when I sat down. The specific look of someone who has encountered information that recalibrated something and is deciding what to do about that recalibration. "This background pull," she said. "Standard protocol," I said. "Post-diplomatic incident." She looked at the document, then at me. "Are you aware of what sovereign tier classification indicates?" "The database says." "The database says very little because very little is allowed to be in the database." She turned the report slightly on her desk. "I was in Defense Administration for 11 years before this posting, coordinator. I saw 3 sovereign tier designations in 11 years. All 3 were individuals whose operational histories had directly shaped Confederation policy at the systemic level." She paused. "Directly, not in a supportive capacity, not in a contributing capacity. Shaped. As in, the Confederation is different than it would have been because of their specific actions." I looked at the report. Errol Mwangi has held that designation since. She checked a notation I hadn't been able to access from my clearance level for the last 40 years. I did the math. He'd received sovereign tier classification when he was 41. What does that mean? I asked, practically. Sundqvist looked at me steadily. It means that for the last 40 years, anyone in the Confederation defense and intelligence hierarchy who has looked at this man's file has understood that they are looking at someone of extraordinary historical and operational significance. She paused. And then they've gone about their business, because that is what Errol Mwangi has consistently, for 40 years, asked them to do. He chose this, I said. He chose to be here. He's chosen where he is at every step, she said. This isn't his first maintenance posting, it's his fourth. She looked at the document. After Praxis, he could have had, from what I understand of sovereign tier treatment, any posting in the Confederation that existed. He's an 8-time decorated operative. He speaks 17 languages by the notation here. 17. She set the document down. He asked for maintenance. The silence in her office lasted a while. Does he know we've read this? She finally asked. He knows the pull was made, I said. He knew before I went to talk to him. I think he's been through this before. She nodded slowly. What did he say? He said the floor needs doing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked out the window of her office toward the atrium below, where the saltstone floor caught the morning light the way it always did. Leave the report in my queue, she said. I'll handle the diplomatic incident documentation. A pause, and I'll handle Admiral Rovin's advisory note. How? I asked. She picked up her comm unit. By responding to it, she said. 3 weeks later, Admiral Rovin returned to Meridian Hub 7. This was not on the schedule. His first visit had been a routine diplomatic transit, passing through on the way to a Confederation subcommittee session in the outer systems. His second visit was, according to the official documentation, a courtesy recheck on the facility's transit protocols. I didn't believe that for a second. Director Sundqvist had sent her response to the Admiral's advisory note 6 days after my conversation with her. I never saw the text of what she sent. She hadn't shared it with me, which was entirely her prerogative. But whatever she'd sent, it had prompted a Kelthari Admiral to return to a mid-transit hub he'd already passed through. I'm not going to speculate about what was in that message. I'm going to tell you what I saw. It was a 7:40 arrival, close to the same time as the first visit. I don't know if that was deliberate. The saltstone floor was shining the way it always shines after Errol's morning pass. Errol was at the eastern section again, finishing the last of his arcs near the support column, when Rovin came through the main receiving corridor. Same attendants, same Herald drone, same Admiral's regalia, but something in the bearing was different, not diminished. The Kelthari don't do diminished, but somehow calibrated, like someone who has received information and is deciding what to do with it. Rovin stopped about 10 meters from Errol. Errol straightened up, turned, looked at the Admiral. The two of them stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Rovin dismissed his attendants, not sent them away entirely, but moved them back out of the immediate vicinity. The Herald drone lowered its altitude. The aide took 3 steps back. And Rovin spoke. Not to the aide, directly to Errol. In Kelthari, at a quieter register, not soft. The Kelthari don't really do soft, but without the performative resonance. Like a real conversation. I was on level 4. I couldn't hear the words, but I was watching. Errol listened, without moving. That same quality, present interior, occupied with something. Then he said something back, 3 or 4 words. I couldn't read lips across 40 meters of atrium. The Admiral's skin shifted. Still dark, but differently dark. The Kelthari shade I'd eventually learn, weeks later when I did more reading, means something like the specific discomfort of having been wrong about something you were very certain of. Rovin spoke again, longer this time. Errol listened, then he did something I wasn't expecting. He held out his hand. Human handshake posture, palm out, fingers extended. The atrium, which was filling up with the 7:45 transit rush, didn't stop. The world kept moving around this moment the way the world always does. Rovin looked at the hand, at Errol's face, at the hand again. Then the Admiral, 4-star grade, 17 campaign veteran, ranking officer of the Kelthari Dominion's 3rd Expedition Fleet, took one step forward and shook it. The Kelthari don't shake hands. It's not in their physical vocabulary, their greeting protocols, their diplomatic handbook. I looked it up afterward. But Ravin shook Errol Mwanga's hand. It was brief. It was formal. It looked slightly uncertain on the Admiral's side in the way that only happens when someone is doing something for the first time and doing it deliberately. Then the Admiral stepped back. His skin had shifted to something I didn't have a reference for yet in the color vocabulary, something between the dark Fortis comfort and the violet baseline. He said one more thing. Errol nodded, and then the Admiral turned and walked toward the upper levels, his attendants falling in behind him, the Herald drone resuming its altitude. And Errol turned back to the floor and finished his arc. I went down afterward. Of course I went down. He was at his equipment station, winding down the morning routine. I walked up and he looked at me, and there was something in the expression that was just barely amused. What did he say? I asked. Errol folded the buffer cloth. He said he had been given some information about my history, that he had some thoughts about the previous visit. What thoughts? He said. Errol paused, and there was a quality in the pause, something he was choosing carefully, that in Kelthari tradition the lineages of fallen dynasties are honored in a specific way. There's a word for it. Vethkara. It means something like the light that continues after the fire. I looked at him. He said he was not aware that he was speaking to someone of Vethkara standing, that if he had been aware, his remarks would have been different. Different how? He didn't specify. His Kelthari specificity in that context would be considered a kind of breach. Errol straightened up, tucking the cloth away. But he also said, and this is the part I'll think about for a while, that in his experience, someone of Vethkara standing who is not living in the shadow of their lineage, but in the work of their own choosing is, another pause, the second hardest kind of person to correctly perceive. What's the hardest? I asked. He looked at me with those eyes. The one who doesn't know, he said. The one who has no idea what they carry. At least I have the advantage of the choice. I asked him, before he left for the day, the question I'd been carrying since I first read the report. The operational silence seal, the thing I'm not cleared for. I looked at him. Are you ever going to? Is that something that gets declassified? He considered. Probably not in my lifetime, maybe not in yours. He moved toward the maintenance corridor. There are events that need to stay settled. Some things, once you open them up again, he shook his head, not dramatically, just factually. The world made a decision about some things. The Confederation made a decision. And I agreed that it was the right decision, and that my being a part of it didn't need to be the thing people focused on. He stopped at the corridor entrance, turned back. The floor, he said, is more interesting anyway. Is it? I asked. Sure, nobody argues about it. Nobody builds a monument to it. Nobody has to reckon with what it means politically. He looked at the atrium, the saltstone, the still water sheen in the morning light. You do it right and it just is right. That's the whole thing. That's it. He went through the corridor. The door closed behind him. I stayed in the atrium for a while after he left. I don't know how long. The 800 rush moved around me. Beings of 17 different species crossing a floor they didn't look at, moving toward their transits and their appointments and their own complicated lives. The saltstone caught the light the way it always did, every arc overlapping perfectly, every section done right. Somewhere in the upper levels, Admiral Ravin of the Kelthari Dominion was probably in a conference sweet-talking about subcommittee business, or transit protocols, or whatever brought him here the second time, carrying a word in his own language, Vethkara, that he'd applied out loud to a man in a gray maintenance uniform who was now on his way home. Somewhere in the Confederation's restricted archives, behind 17 classification layers and an operational silence seal, there was a record of something that had shaped galactic history, and one of the people at its center had decided that the record was less important than the morning. And in 9 different archives, British Museum, Egyptian National Archives, Confederation Historical Registry, and 6 others, there were documents establishing a lineage that reached back over 1,000 years. A dynasty that had been thought extinct for 2 centuries. Light that had continued after the fire. Vethkara. Errol Mwangi was going home to, presumably, eat breakfast. Come back tomorrow at 5:59, pick up where he'd left off. I thought about what he'd said. The things nobody looks at are still there. I thought about it for a while. Then I went upstairs. I had transit forms to process. But I took one more look at the floor before I went.